Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us again after the break. Hope you went and viewed some posters and stretched your legs. We're going to go ahead and get started again. Thank you for joining us. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I will go over a few of the housekeeping items again. As you all are probably aware, we are recording these workshops, and we'll make an archived version available online shortly after it is over. Everyone is on mute, including most of the speakers as well until it's their turn. You're going to remain on mute and during the presentations. And each presenter will have about 15 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. During the Q&A, there will be 2 ways for you to ask questions. One way is to type in your question in the chat feature that you see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. We'll be monitoring these questions and queuing them up as they come in for the speakers. The second option is to raise your hand by clicking on the button in the middle of the screen that's kind of got the raise hand button. You'll only be able to raise your hand if you have connected your voice audio over the phone or voice over IP. That means you have some sort of audio connected to the webinar, and then we'll be able to take you off mute. So if you didn't do one of those two, make sure you type in your chat questions instead. During the Q&A, we're going to alternate back and forth between both the questions that come in on the chat as well as those who raise their hand. And hopefully we'll get to as many of those as possible. But if we don't get to all the questions, we'll queue those up and send them to the speaker, and we'll have them answer your questions after the presentation. And do please remember, try to keep your questions succinct and to the point. Everyone's been doing a great job so far. And with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Yolande Serra. She is the chair for session 4, and she's from the University of Washington. Yolande? No?
Of the
Sorry, Yolande, I had you on mute. Can you start over?
Oh.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, welcome to the 4th session of the IASCLiP virtual workshop, Initiatives to Improve Observational Coverage of the Ocean, Land, and Atmosphere. So there are 4 speakers in the session. As Jill or Kristen said, they get 15 minutes each. We'll hear a 13-minute little bell, and then there'll be 5 minutes for Q&A. So the first speaker is John Braun. The talk is entitled COCONet and TLALOCNet, Providing the Intra-Americas Sea Region with Enhanced Atmospheric Observational Capacity. The next speaker will be David Adams, who will be speaking on GPS meteorological networks for process-oriented studies of tropical deep convection. The third speaker is Frank Mueller-Karger, who will be talking about the CARIACO Ocean Time Series, 2 decades of biogeochemistry and ecological research to understand ocean and climate variability. And finally, we will have Ricardo Dominguez, who will speak on sustained and targeted ocean observations for improving Atlantic tropical cyclone intensity and hurricane seasonal forecasts. So these are all very interesting operational networks, and we'll go ahead and hear about the first one from John. John, go ahead.
Thanks, Yolande. I'll move ahead. So as Yolande mentioned, I'll be talking about 2 projects. One is COCONet and one is TLALOCNet. I'm speaking on behalf of primarily 2 groups, UNAVCO, which is a geodetic support community, principally funded by the National Science Foundation, and then the COSMIC program here at UCARP. Oh, sorry, I'm learning this. Here we go. So what COCONet and TLALOCNet, what do those 2 acronyms really mean? COCONet is the continuously operating Caribbean observational network, and TLALOCNet is the transboundary land and atmosphere long-term observation and collaborative network. It's named after an Aztec god of rain, fertility, and water. These are rather unique projects in that they are primarily infrastructure projects funded by the National Science Foundation. They are also primarily looking at natural hazards. But the natural hazards are sort of bidirectional. They're geodynamic hazards and atmospheric dynamic hazards. So the sorts of things that are being investigated with both of these networks are earthquake hazards, tectonic deformation, climate variability, and severe weather. One major component of this is the ability to provide open data products to the community for use to support individual researchers. It is not designed, as you will see in the network, it is more a synoptic scale, so it is not looking at very small scale processes, but what it's trying to do is to provide infrastructure to support individual researchers on specific topics. So this is a map of COCONet and TLALOCNet stations in the IASCLiP region. Basically, you can look at it in a number of different ways. Let me get my mouse here. In that either the yellow circles or yellow diamonds are instruments that have already been installed as part of the network. So much of the sites that are basically from the Yucatan to the east are considered COCONet sites. The sites that are in Mexico are TLALOCNet sites. The sites that are red are instruments that are still remaining to be upgraded. And then there are a number of regional data centers in Mexico, Nicaragua, Colombia, and Barbados that are supporting this concept of free and open data. So if you sort of look along this, there are a number of stations all in Central America, and there are a number of stations across the Caribbean and South America, from basically the continental landmass to larger islands in Hispaniola to very small islands and very small cays in the Caribbean Sea and also the Pacific. Currently, as of the end of this last fiscal quarter, there have been 75 sites as part of COCONet that have been newly installed or refurbished as part of the project. There are 9 remaining. Most of those are in Venezuela. This one is Colombia, this one is Colombia, and then a few remaining sites in Mexico and Hispaniola and Turks and Caicos. And TLALOCNet is partially finished with its network upgrade. So this is what a typical either COCONet or TLALOCNet station looks like. It has a GPS receiver. This is a site in Panama. We have an example site in Jamaica, actually on a very small cay, Pedro Cay, and a site in Honduras on Swan Island, which is also a very small island. So it has a GPS antenna. This is a geodetic quality antenna for looking at sort of at millimeter changes in the position of the station. It has a instrument box, mostly powered by solar panels, and then it has a METS pack installed about 2 meters above ground. So here is the antenna and MET pack for. Here's the antenna and MET pack for Panama. Here's the antenna. The MET pack is back here for Pedro Cay, and here's the antenna and MET pack for Swan Island. The MET sensor is a IASCLiP WXT instrument. It records pressure, temperature, relative humidity, winds, horizontal winds, and rain. It does this in 5-minute intervals. It has relatively good specifications. It has a 0.5 hectopascal accuracy for pressure, 1/3 of a degree Celsius for temperature, 3% relative humidity, and rain with about 5% accuracy. The rain sensor is a little bit of a new sensor in that it's a head that's located on the top of the WXT sensor. These little legs here are used for sonic measurements of horizontal winds, and then the rain sensor is this little head that's on top of it. And so there's a nice paper by Jeff Bosser et al. From the Oklahoma Mesonet group, basically evaluating what these rain gauges, what these WXT rain gauges would do compared to either tipping buckets or other sort of more standard rain gauge estimates. And you can see that that the general scatter here for the WXT instrument versus a tipping bucket has a quite high correlation, 0.95, slope of about 0.74. So there's a little bit of a maybe the WXT was recording a little bit more rain than the tipping buckets, but they had a linear regression to rescale these, and that seemed to work just fine. And so I think that these sensors, they may have a slight systematic difference, but they've also now, this was an early study conducted by the people at the Oklahoma Mesonet, and I would think that these tipping buckets or that these range sensors are now calibrated in-house. One problem that was happening with our early installs, is that we were having, these were installed in basically pretty severe maritime environments, and the WXTs were sort of getting their first use in this sort of environment. So there was a lot of salt buildup on the instruments. There was a significant amount of corrosion on the data port, and that corrosion was making it onto the motherboard and causing some failures. Vaisala was very good in handling these instruments, and so they have now retrofitted all of these WXTs with a sealed cap, and that sealed cap, I think, has increased the reliability of these instruments quite drastically. So one of the products that is being produced out, besides the surface observations, is that the GPS instrument can also be used to measure the delay in the atmosphere. The delay caused by the atmosphere can be related to total precipitable water or precipitable water, and it is when we are producing precipitable water estimates at 30-minute intervals across the Caribbean and into the United States. So here is a map overlaid on top of a GOES IR image, and each one of these numbers represents the total column water vapor at that station at that location. So this is in 2012 for a storm that was building up. Here's Jamaica, and so you can, and the total amount of water vapor is basically color-coded by its number. So relatively large amounts of water vapor, 53 millimeters, 58 millimeters in Hispaniola, relatively low amounts of water vapor in central Mexico, in the 20s or possibly 30s. As Yolande mentioned earlier, one nice thing about GPS is that it's an all-weather sensor. That means that it is really unaffected by rain, clouds, and other things. So it works well in storms. It works well in clear air, and it provides time resolution that can be 30 minutes or down to 5 minutes, really. We have our processing system right now running at 30-minute intervals. So it is a nice network, and we actually process more data up into the continental United States. And right now, this project, COCONet, is embedded within a larger project called SUMINet, where there are approximately 500 stations reporting in the CONUS region every half hour. So we've been running these instruments for a number of years now, and we've been able to do some comparisons of COCONet water vapor to model analysis water vapor. We have done 2 primary analyses right now. We've looked at the GFS model at its analysis time and also the ERA interim analysis. So basically 0, 6, 12, 18 UTC every day. And if we plot the GPS water vapor and the GFS water vapor as basically a scatter plot, things look relatively good. There's a pretty high correlation, 0.94. There's a slope of about 0.84, which is a little bit odd, but it's there. And you see a distribution that looks pretty Gaussian. But here, if you look at if you plot the differences between the GPS water vapor and the GFS water vapor as a function of the total water vapor driven by, or as measured by the GPS, you sort of see a trend here in that the GFS, the sign here is that this should actually be GFS minus GPS. So you can see that the GFS is wet with respect to the GPS up until about 40 millimeters or about 45 millimeters of water vapor, and then the GFS becomes dry with respect to the GPS for water vapor amounts greater than 45 millimeters. So what that is telling you is, and the GPS has been validated against a number of different things. So what that is implying is that the analysis of the GFS model in relatively low water vapor environments is wet with respect to the truth. So there's a bias there. But then in relatively wet atmospheric conditions, so over 45 millimeters, is that bias flips. Then it happens to be the GFS model becomes dry with respect to the truth. So that is an interesting thing. And if you look at the ERA interim analysis, you have a scatter plot, the correlation is 9.2, the correlation or the slope is 0.85. But if you look at the same difference, if you look at GPS water vapor, the difference between ERA minus GPS as a function of GPS water vapor here, you basically see the same thing in that the the era interim is wet with respect to GPS below 45 millimeters and dry with respect to GPS greater than 45 millimeters. I do not have a plot in here at this time, but you can basically do the same sort of comparison of GPS versus satellite microwave total precipitable water vapor measurements, and it's basically this pattern of wet model versus at low water vapor amounts versus dry model at high water vapor amounts matches what the comparison is from GPS to the satellite microwave radiometers. And so that basically matches because most of the data that's going into these large global analysis are these microwave data sets over the ocean. And that implies that there's a significant problem in both in the analysis and also the satellite retrievals. If you then go ahead and look at how the GFS model, the GFS is forecast every day out to 240 hours. So if you would then go ahead and look at, this is year 2013, October of 2013 at the analysis time, and then 2013 at model forecast 10 at 1200 and 2400, and then this is a year later in September. You have a distribution of differences between water vapor amounts between GPS and GFS. So the GPS happens to be the blue histogram here, and the GFS, oh, is that my time?
That's your time at 13 minutes, so 2 more minutes to try to wrap up, please.
Okay, so I'll skip this one because it's a little bit complicated, but I'll move over here. And so we've done some looking at sort of the differences between GPS and the forecast length. And what we can see is that in 2013, October 2013, January 2014, and September 2014, is we basically have the GFS error from analysis time to forecast at 2400 or 240 hours. And then so if you combine all of these together, you can see that the January forecast does have a bias that comes in at about forecast hour 72 or so, and that the error, the differences between the GPS and the model, basically saturate out at about 72 hours too. So then you're almost at climatology at hour 72. One other thing that you can do with GPS is that you can compare to sea surface temperature. So we have a number of sites here, and so this is Grand Turk, this is Saint Martin, this is Grenada, this is Isla de San Andreas in Colombia, which would be right here. And then the red is the sea surface temperature at that site, and the blue is the total column integrated water vapor at that site. And so it looks pretty clear that there's a correlation here over time. And if we go ahead and we sort of plot these correlations, there's these scatter plots. There's if you would do a regression on here, it would be pretty interesting. There would be some pretty high correlations. But then we really want to know what would happen if we would, is this just a correlation because they are both following the same seasonal pattern, or is there a true correlation of what is going on a very local scale? So in this bottom panel here would be either the red of the sea surface temperature or the blue of the total column water vapor, and we fit that over a number of years to an annual signal. And this annual signal is here as in the second panel, and then we remove that annual signal from both the sea surface temperature and the water vapor amount, and so we sort of have an anomaly here to sort of see what it looks like. And this is for Grenada, and this is for Barbados. The one on the left is Grenada and one is Barbados. So while there is a lot of correlation on the sort of the annual scale, as you look over on when you remove what the annual variability would be, that there is much less correlation. And so if you would sort of do this all across scales and you sort of remove what the annual signal is, there's some connection there, but there is not a lot. And so if you would sort of look at this again on a basin-wide, if you would look at this correlation on just the annual signal, so if you do not remove any sort of annual trend, you have a correlation that sits at about 0.6 to 0.7 over all of the sites that we have, almost all of the sites that we have. but if you remove what the annual signal is on both the sea surface temperature and the water vapor, that the correlation goes significantly down. So what that I think is implying is that on a very small scale, basically directly above the ocean surface, is that there is not direct response there, and that makes sense because you have the low-level jet that's advecting moisture away, and so that ocean coupling is maybe a little bit more sophisticated than being just coupled directly to the atmosphere above the ocean surface. So how can you get to all of this data? All of the atmospheric data products from COCONet and TLALOCNet are available through the SUMINET webpage, which is the UCAR Cosmic Program webpage. On that webpage, there are precipitable water vapor and half-hour mean estimates of the surface observations in either an ASCII format or a NetCDF format. You can get the data from either an LDM stream through a Unidata project LDM, looking at feed type FT18, or you can download the data directly through the following URL here. One interesting thing is that the 5-minute updates of surface observations, which is the fine-scale surface observations, are now available on the NOAA GTS under data type SXCA51, and you can get those on an hourly basis. So, in summary, the data from COCONet and TLALOCNet have a record of sufficient length so that they can start being used for model evaluation studies. We have discovered a bias that changes in the GFS analysis and also the ERA interim analysis, and that the model appears wet at relatively small amounts of water vapor and dry at large amounts of water vapor. We did some initial analysis of looking at the GFS forecast, primarily looking at large storm tracks, and the model error does grow from about 3 millimeters to about 8 to 10 millimeters after about 72 hours. And the GFS water vapor field tends to sort of get smoothed out at about 72 hours as well. On an annual view, SST and water vapor are highly correlated, but if you do an anomaly analysis, that these correlations are more related to seasonal variability in both of the data sets. We'll have to sort of extend this analysis to look at air parcels as they cross the Caribbean Basin, but that is some of our initial results. I should say that COCONet and TLALOCNet are collaborative projects. For UNAVCO is a primary controlling the network. UCAR is doing a lot of the data analysis, but it has a number of universities that are also participating, as well as the collaboration from more than 25 international partners through the Caribbean and Latin America who are directly involved in all of the activities of these two projects. I'm finished.
Great, thanks, John. Yolande, you're off mute. Did you have any thoughts or comments or questions before we go to the audience?
I see there are a couple of good questions in the audience, so I just want to thank John for presenting on this data set, this great data set, and let's defer to these questions.
Great. It looked like Teddy had a question. I think you were touching on this a little bit towards the end, but maybe you can emphasize. He wanted to know, does this confirm what we would expect? Advection of TPW varies much greater than changes in sea surface temperature.
Yes, I think that it clearly does, and that water vapor in the atmosphere can be advected from quite a long ways. And so I think that some of the Paul Durmeyer talk yesterday was interesting and probably relevant on how these data might be used to sort of look at advection and sort of transport of moisture across the Caribbean. And I think that that's an interesting next step.
Great. And one more question looks like we have from Alejandro. It says, from the comparison with reanalyses, it seems that they have a narrower range than the GPS estimates. Is that related with the size of the represented region? For example, smaller in the GPS estimates of 10 kilometer and larger in the ERAI at 80 kilometers?
That would be my guess, is that GPS is basically sensitive to about a radius of about 10 or 15 kilometers around the station. And so if you would compare that to the model, the 0.25 degree model analysis from the GPS or GFS, that there is probably more very small scale availability in the GPS than the model.
Okay. And I think we have about 1 more minute, so we'll take the last question here from Vasu. Vasu, you're off mute. Go ahead.
Yes. I was curious to know, did you say at the beginning of the talk that this was funded by NSF?
That's correct.
So what are the plans to sustain it beyond the lifetime of the NSF support?
That's a great question. So the COCONet project is completing its 5-year infrastructure in this year. I think both UNAVCO and UCAR will have a no-cost extension that will extend it, but we will most likely submit a follow-up to extend the project for another couple of years. But it is important that we develop a community that recognizes the value, or that finds value and need for these observations, so that we can build up some sort of broader support to keep these networks running.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. We'll go on to our next presenter, and that should be Dave. Dave, you're off mute, and I think you should probably just go ahead and take over controls.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, Yolande, John, fellow speakers. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm on a phone, so. Greetings from Mexico City. Let me grab my talk here. Okay. All right, basically this is going to be a rapid summary of some of the work we've done recently, in some of it in collaboration with Yolande. And because of the context here, I want to give a little clarification. I'm not going to touch on anything related to the Inter-American seas per se, but what I'd like you to think about is how GPS can be used for process-oriented studies of convection. So that's kind of the basic idea here. Okay, so basically we'll talk about 3 different convection regimes: the tropical continental regime, a tropical sea breeze regime, and the North American monsoon regime. And taking advantage of the new available infrastructure that John was just talking about, I think these type of studies can be expanded into this region. Okay, so how do I click on this? Is there just a little delay?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's changing our end. Make sure the easiest, most efficient way is hovering above the slides in the middle where you see the
clicking on it? Okay.
Yep, try that. No, right above the slide deck. So hover your mouse just.
Right here. Okay.
Yeah. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. So basically, what I'll do real rapidly, I'll try to get through this quickly enough, is to show how we can use GPS for convection and water vapor interactions. And we'll give 3 different examples. We'll use our tropical continental site in Manaus in the central Amazon, where we developed a climatology for the shallow to deep convective transition. I'll mention the expansion of that network into a dense network of 20 or so GPSs and why we did that. Then we'll go to the tropical sea breeze regime, which actually could be pertinent to much of the region we're interested in here in this workshop. And we'll talk about propagating squall lines as the phenomenon we observe, and then I'll finish up with a talk of a recent project we did, Yolande and my colleagues from the University of Arizona and a few other places here in Mexico, where we looked at, we took a re-examination of the monsoon, and we're going to look specifically at the diurnal cycle. And then given that John's talk was pretty well done, I think I'll just skip over the last, but everything that I say here should be done in the or thought of in the context. Let me say one thing. What do I mean by process-oriented? Here I mean that the PWV derived from, or column water vapor derived from the GPS is the principal variable involved in the study. This is the variable that we actually use to make mechanistic deductions of the processes that determine convection, intensity, timescales, etc. PWV, or column water vapor, has a very long history, venerable history in tropical meteorology. If you think of the work, for example, of David Raymond or David Neeland, Brian Mapes, Larissa Back, a bunch of these people that have worked on theory between convection and large-scale interactions in the tropic base their theories and base their ideas on column water vapor, which, considering that, I've been kind of surprised that GPS hasn't expanded more, given its qualities, into tropics, and I'll try to make an argument why it should. Okay. In terms of convection, well, it basically dominates the climate in the tropics, climates in the meteorology tropics. When we're talking about the Caribbean in Atlantic and East Pac, we're more probably concerned with kind of perturbed weather associated with different oscillations and different waveforms. However, just in general, convection has this property that it grows from very small cumulus type scale. Here you can see the little baby cumulus over the Amazon, and then they grow into larger, more organized forms. This is very difficult. One, it's very difficult to observe. The tropics are notoriously absent in terms of observational platforms. But also, if you think in a modeling context, it's a multi-scale process that the model has to actually represent correctly at each phase of the scale. In terms of climate and basically the function of convection, if convection organizes onto the mesoscale systems, its nature, so to speak, the way it transports energy in the vertical becomes very different as opposed to something like the hot tower hypothesis. So it's very important to consider how convection actually organizes and transports energy. Now, our interest here specifically is how does convection relate to the water vapor fields that it develops in. Okay. Go forward. Okay. So why is it important to understand water vapor and convection relationships? Well, okay, but I don't think I need to make much of an argument about water vapor being the most important greenhouse gas. But more importantly, for the tropics, the tropical free troposphere, the only source of water vapor that it has is basically deep convection. The tropics, unlike higher latitudes, do not have strong temperature gradients, but they do have strong gradients in water vapor. These gradients, or the time and space variability in water vapor, determines where convection occurs, yet convection is the source of water vapor. So we have a very, very serious problem here. This is a very difficult problem. Convection determines the distribution and is also a function of it. Now, if you put this in the context, for example, of changing climate and warming climate with perhaps more total water, column water vapor, one question becomes, how does convection's ability to organize change with changes in total water vapor or water vapor distribution? Again, with the idea that organized convection becomes very efficient in upscale transport of energy and other chemical species, etc. Okay. So these are things that we have to consider just in general. Now, as I mentioned before, it's a multi-scale phenomenon that's hard to parameterize. And if you think in the traditional paradigm like Arakawa and Schubert, where you have large-scale forcing and convection reaction, if you think of the work, for example, Brian Mapes or Bretherton or something like that, where we find that this rigid scale separation is actually not that rigid and that convection actually has a large-scale component within it, that becomes very difficult. You could argue we don't have to worry about parameterization because it's going the way of the dinosaurs, but that doesn't solve the problem. We can go down to convective resolving models or large eddy scale stipulations, but that's not a panacea because then you just bump the parameterization problem down to a different scale. For example, think of the work that's been being done recently on entrainment in models. That's very important because that determines the buoyancy and hence the intensity of the convection. So we need small scale observations to be able to constrain these models. Let's move forward there. Okay. John spoke a little bit about this, so I won't give much detail here. Basically, GPS, we use the delay in the signal, and we calculate precipitable water. Okay, basically we get a neutral delay. If we have a local pressure measurement, we can pull out the hydrostatic part. That leaves the wet delay, and then as a function of temperature and a function of latitude, we can convert that into precipitable water. And as John said, that can be as high as 5 minutes, and it's all weather. The effects of cloud droplets, ice, rainfall is very small, and that's what makes it ideal, particularly because clouds and rainfall are the conditions that we're really interested in. When we first got into developing kind of GPS for much smaller scale, mesoscale experiments, we started in Brazil, in the central Amazon, in Manaus, and we set up the first station. I believe this is probably, at least I make this claim, it was probably the world's first real-time equatorial station. Starting back in 2008, it lived until 2012, so we had about 3.5 years of data, and it was centered at the INPA. NOAA processed the data for us in real time at 30 minutes, and we had the surface met with a met package, like John was saying. And you can obviously use that for developing climatologies like we do here, the convective climatology. Okay. Now, the thing that I want to talk about here is the first example of a process-oriented study. This goes way back, and this is relevant also for the Inter-American seas and tropical regime. Models do not do very well with the diurnal cycle of convection. And that goes way back. You get the timing wrong, the intensity is wrong. The Cape trigger and Cape closure based, like kind of the Arakawa and Schubert type schemes, they tend to be triggered too early and too often. And in most cases, the shallow to deep transition, that progression between cumulus to cumulonimbus, is instantaneous. So it's skipped entirely, which is totally unrealistic and can have negative consequences for the dynamics and the radiations of the model. So in recent time, and I don't mention all the studies here, but there's quite a few that have looked at the shallow to deep transition for tropical continental regimes. And they've come up with various physical mechanisms which they argue control the transition. For example, cold pools, cold pool convergence, moistening above the boundary layer, an unstable atmosphere with respect to clouds, etc. There's about 5 or 6 different arguments. Every single one of these papers is a modeling study. It's high-resolution model or even to LES. None of them use any type of observations to which to stand on, so to speak, for their deductions. So we thought, well, this is a good opportunity to see if we can derive some important, maybe, timescales that could serve the kind of the modeling community. So we took our 3 years of data, surface data, PWV, cloud top temperature to represent cloud growth, 320 events, convective events we determined. It rains a lot in Manaus, and we wrote this paper here in GRL. And if you want to see all the details, you can check it out. I'm just going to skip over it real quickly. Our basic argument, we use the water conservation equation. This is already a simplified form, and again, you can see the approximations. And we come up with, on the scale of the shallow to deep transition, we can approximate water vapor, the moisture flux convergence as the time rate of change of PWV. That is what we measure with the GPS. So the basic climatology looks like this. You have PWV on this axis, precip and cloud top temperature. So you have a kind of a linear 8-hour, if you look at the time scale here, linear 8-hour ramp up. Evaporation is probably important there. And then a very quick 4-hour ramp up in terms of water vapor convergence and cloud development. And this just represents kind of cold pools. You can think of it, or downdrafts, drop in temperature, rise in wind speed. Okay, go ahead. Okay. What we did is we sliced and diced the different 320 events into daytime versus nocturnal, moist versus dry, and intense versus weak. And what you'll notice if you look carefully, if you can kind of see it, the shallow to deep transition time scale is almost always 4 hours, T-4, T-4. The only difference is at nighttime you have a T-6. However, we argue in the paper that if you actually look at it, the real ramp-up time is still about 4 hours. So we have a 4-hour continental water vapor convergence time scale. At this point, we would ask our modeling colleagues to take that into account and run their high-resolution models in ensemble mode or develop their own climatology and see if they can reproduce that result. Calculating precipitable water in a model is trivial. So this is a nice test to make sure that the physics of their models are correct and their mechanistic deductions that follow from them are something that we can lend credence to. After the from the INPA station, that's a little green one right here in the middle, we expanded the dense network. And arrived at up to 20 stations between April and 2011, 2012. You'll notice the distribution's a bit strange. Well, this is because Manaus is surrounded by rainforest and rivers. However, that was actually helpful, and think of this in the context of some of the areas you would have to, some of the land areas you'd have to deal with in terms of, for example, the land bridge, the isthmus, or some of the islands in the sea areas. We show John. I don't think John really made much of a reference to this, but you don't really need very stable, pretty monuments to be able to get nice PWV. I think even John did something from a boat or a buoy one time. And so you can look at our paper in JTech a while back, and also we talk a little bit more about it in BAMS. But what this implies is that for us, meteorology, atmospheric sciences, it's cheaper. And we can install on a flux tower like the LBA flux tower here in the central Amazon. We can put them on a chicken coop. We can put them on a palafitas where you have flooding and shaking, or in a neighborhood in Belem. So you could think about any of these. As long as you don't have a lot of blockage and the thing isn't moving too much, you'll get good PWV. The second process-oriented study is looking at these tropical squall lines that come in off the coast, the sea breeze. We set up a second network during the GPM Chuva, the Global Precipitation Measurement Campaign. This was led in Brazil by Luis Machado, and we have a BAMS paper on that also. We set it up for the 40 days of the campaign. We had radiosondes, we had cloud radars, LIDARs, flux measurements, a bunch of very nice data. And we wanted to investigate the nature of these interesting squall lines that come in either from the Atlantic or grow right along the coast and then propagate inland. And sometimes they can propagate all the way across the Amazon. Hard to believe, but they actually can do that. So what we did was we took convective days with the squall lines versus non-convective days, that is no squall lines, and took a look at our trace or our behavior of precipitable water. What you find, not surprisingly, is you get much stronger convergence on the propagating days. You can also use the peaks of the perturbations to come up with some type of propagation speed for the perturbations. Likewise, for the non-convective days, not surprising, very weak convergence, very slow propagation. Again, think in the model context. Whatever your model does, it must be able to reduce this or reproduce this type of behavior. Physically, what happens, it appears that along the sea breeze front, you get converging and coalescing cells. If that happens, these things will propagate inland and cross Belem, which is pretty much in this area around here. On the days when that doesn't happen, you don't get the propagation. So in principle, this is where I have my animation. Okay.
Got that running now. Okay. Give me 1 second. And Dave, we're also at about 15, 16 minutes now, so let's wrap up.
Whoa. Oh, sheesh. Boy, am I going slow?
That's okay.
Did the bell go off? I didn't hear it.
It did. That's okay.
Okay. So just take a look at this. I have to thank Brian Mapes for this. He made the animation for me. But just take a look as we cycle through the day. You'll see that on the convective days, you do get convergence and growth and then propagation through the Belem area. And on the non-convective days, you don't. We can skip on to the next. We came through thermodynamic, we calculated thermodynamic dynamic parameters to try to understand why. Basic take-home story, slightly more unstable, but not statistically significant. Water vapor convergence much higher, dynamic forcing exactly the same. We argue that you basically get lift from the cold pool dynamics of these propagating tropical squall lines, and that causes the vertical acceleration, which causes the water vapor convergence. So that is, convection causes convergence. Okay, and real quick, just to finish, the final experiment was in northwestern Mexico. We covered a region that's never been covered before, the highest reaches of the SMO, the Sierra Madre Occidental, something they weren't even able to do during the name. You can look at the diurnal cycle as a function of topography. On the east side, water vapor convergence is weak. On the west side, very strong pointed water vapor convergence. That intensifies as you move down the mountain. Okay, so again, think of your model context. John covered this, so I won't cover this. He talked about that. But again, think of all this in the context of developing dense network anchored on the COCONet and the TLALOCNet sites. So PWV, all weather, high frequency. We've looked at 3 regimes. We can apply that to many more in the Caribbean and across the land bridge. I'm personally interested in doing transects across the land bridge. We could look at things like convective propagation or derive timescales like we did for the shallow to deep transition. Okay, so did I get through that pretty quick?
Yeah, thanks
Okay.
so much, Dave. Great.
Thanks.
Yolande, any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, let's see. I guess I would wonder what you think the impact is if you've thought about some of these previous work based on satellite observations, such as that by Nealon looking at thresholds of PWV when looking at the PWV rainfall relationships, and how you think the GPS might impact those results, because it's all weather.
That's actually, thank you, Yolanda. That's a very good question. Yeah, Nealon's theory about kind of the self-organized criticality is basically a function of water vapor. I spoke to him recently. He was very enthusiastic about the Amazon data, and what I demonstrated to him, and this is something I guess John probably made reference to. We can eliminate the bad soundings because many of the soundings actually run through rainy and cloudy weather and then become saturated and unrepresentative. We showed him that with the GPS, he can actually make more accurate measurements of PWV and its variation with respect to precipitation, and he was very excited about that. If you remember, there was the paper by Gilmore very recently that criticized his theory, saying that David Nealon couldn't make the claims he makes because the accuracy of the microwave radiometers are not good enough. So now we can come back and say, well, look, ours are not weather dependent, so maybe you can re-look at your data. Also, there's the argument of looking at it over land as opposed to just ocean, which is typically what's been done. Does that answer your question, Yolande?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Thank you both, and thanks, Dave, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, if there's any other questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll get those off to Dave. We're going to head on to our next speaker, Frank Mueller-Carger from the University of South Florida. Frank, you should be off mute.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Jill. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our project, the CARIACO Ocean Time Series that we've been maintaining off Venezuela and the Southern Caribbean for about the past 21 years. This is a very large project. It involves a lot of people, and so the intro slide doesn't give justice to the number of people. But basically, the people that put this together involve Laura Lorenzoni, Enrique Montes, and especially also Mary Scranton, Gordon Taylor, Bob Tonnell, Claudio Benitez Nelson, Ramon Varela, and Irene Astor are extremely key to this, and they are our Venezuelan colleagues at the Fundación La Salle in Venezuela. So the CARIACO Basin is located in the Southern Caribbean Sea, sort of in the eastern side off of Venezuela, just off of Margarita Island. It's a basin that is probably about 100 kilometers across by 60 to 70 kilometers wide north-south, and it has a very strong seasonality that is captured both in the weather and the oceanography, but also in the sediments at the bottom of the basin. The productivity of this basin is extremely high. It's an upwelling area because it is in the trade winds area, and by experiencing this east to west wind on an east-west coast. It has a classical textbook example of coastal upwelling. That upwelling leads to high nutrient production, high nutrient levels at the surface, and then you end up with high biological productivity. Now, the time series was started in 1995, and it still runs to the present through the funding of the FONACYT in Venezuela and the National Science Foundation in the U.S. The philosophical goal of the Ocean Time Series is to try to understand the variability in weather and oceanographic conditions that lead to biological variation and also variation in the input of sediment from land, and that is then recorded at the bottom of the CARIACO Basin in the form of varves. And this picture here shows what the sediments at the bottom of the basin look like. And so this basin has been very important to paleoclimatologists for a long time now. There have been deep sea drilling programs there to try to extract very long cores. So cores go back now to about 600,000 years. And in this case, you can see you would be able to tell what happened during different epochs in that 60,000 years. So to try to understand how these varves change, why you get these different colors in the sediment, is something that we're trying to explain by looking at modern day oceanography and weather parameters and how these particles form and sink to the bottom. One of the examples of the relevance that these particles have is when they settle to the bottom, they carry with them not only signals that are tied to the composition of phytoplankton at the surface, whether there's more or less phytoplankton, but also the type of phytoplankton. And phytoplankton capture chemicals from the water that are then sunk to the bottom. In this case, the carbon isotope of these coccolithophores, for example, tracks what we call the Suez effect. And so the principle here is that plants, when fossil fuels formed millions of years ago, had a signal that was lighter in carbon-13, and the sediments actually show that. So you can see that not only can you go way back in time, but you can also track modern processes in the sediments. And so, again, we're trying to understand the particles that form, quantity, and type. So the scientific objectives of the Ocean Time Series is understand the composition and settling and quantity of the settling particles and how that relates to ocean chemistry, ecology, terrigenous inputs, and the hydrography. We want to identify the links between the ecosystem changes, so things like biodiversity and productivity in different trophic levels at phytoplankton, zooplankton, even fish if we can, and how that is affected by processes on a broader scale. Now, the paleoclimate studies have shown that there is a link between the sediment variability and larger scale signals in the Atlantic. So we're trying to understand exactly how these links occur. So we would like to look at that by looking at very closely at how bacterial production, how phytoplankton production changes with different oceanographic parameters at the surface. The CARIACO Basin is complicated because it is a basin that effectively is a hole or a basin in the continental shelf of Venezuela, and it's separated by the open Caribbean by a sill. Now that sill is at about 140 meters, so there's an opening to the Caribbean at about 140 meters, and the basin itself is about 1,400 meters deep, so 1,400, and it's very quiescent, and all this productivity that is formed at the surface, when it sinks, it rots, and effectively the water runs out of oxygen. It's been, since the glaciation time, it's become anoxic. So this anoxia allows these varves to deposit in a way that the sediment is not disturbed. So this is a cartoon that shows the project. There's a bunch of scientists making different measurements that include cruises that are done monthly or sometimes more than once or twice a month, so sometimes up to 3 or 4 times. And we collect very classical types of observations with CTDs and lower current meters, but we also have a mooring. The mooring anchored to the bottom has 5 sediment traps. These sediment traps are effectively a cone that has a little robot at the bottom that rotates different cups onto the bottom of this cone every 2 weeks. So we collect the sediments that is falling through the water column so it's integrated over 2-week periods. And we've been doing that for 20 years. So we have a profile of the particle and the particle composition as it falls through the bottom, and then we can compare that to the sediment. At the surface, we measure the typical oceanographic parameters from salinity and temperature, but we also measure biological parameters like primary productivity and taxonomy of the phytoplankton, and so on. We tie these to optical measurements that we make at the surface to try to relate the color of the water to ocean color measurements from satellite, and we also make other types of satellite measurements like sea surface temperature. Since 1995, we've conducted over 200 cruises just to what we call the core programs to make these measurements, and then we have nearly 40 sediment and current meter recovery and redeployment cruises. Then on top of that, we have separate biogeochemical and microbial process studies. So the anoxic interface, where the water is kind of oxic in the upper 140 meters because it exchanges openly with the Caribbean, but below 140 meters, it becomes anoxic. That interface is an area of extremely active microbial growth, and there's layers of different microbes that consume different chemicals as you go into deeper and you run out of oxygen. So these processes change our particles or generate new particles. So we need to understand what's going on there to understand the flux of particles to the bottom. All our data literally is open. As soon as we have it quality controlled, we make it openly available, and we post it on any number of websites from NODC to websites from Venezuela and something called Dicodemo at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and our own website at the University of South Florida. Of course, this has led to a large number of publications regarding the CARIACO Basin, all these processes. That is, I'm not going to belabor this, but it is a productive group. And so some of the insights that we've gotten is we can actually see we have lived through the period of warming that we have seen since the late 1990s in the Caribbean Sea. And that's about 1 degree centigrade in the past 20 years. And that during that period, we have seen different changes. For example, we have seen a decrease in the intensity of the trade wind, as not quite a meter per second in the east to west strength, but almost. And that's enough to decrease the upwelling that we would normally see at the beginning of the year. It doesn't affect the upwelling in the fall too much, although we have seen a strong increase in the temperature, especially during the first half of the year, just because the upwelling has decreased. So that warming is not just happening in the Caribbean. It's something that many of you would know is happening throughout the tropical Atlantic. It is also something that has led to changes in the interior of the CARIACO Basin. So not only has the productivity and the taxonomy of the phytoplankton changed in the upper water column, but it has changed the physics of the basin. For example, we have seen a decrease in the density of waters at depth in the CARIACO Basin. This is water that would normally see an increase in density because you have these intrusions of Caribbean water, effectively subtropical underwater water that is very saline, and it sinks along the sides of the basin. Well, these intrusions have decreased in the past 20 years, so there's been a relative freshening of the waters in the basin. So we have documented these changes over the past 20 years. The data is open. I invite people that are interested in climate and in modeling the climate of the Caribbean to look at these data. It extends from physical into biological and chemical data. It is a site that captures what happens at larger spatial scales in the North Atlantic, so it's a good record. The data are available, or just write us and we will make it. We will send you whatever you need. So where we are is we're going to try to maintain the time series for a few more years. This is a program that is reviewed every 3 to 5 years by the National Science Foundation. We're up for renewal next year, so that's a new proposal, brand new review. So we go through that anguish every single time. We do have the high temporal resolution that we want to maintain and link carbon production, export, and climate change scale, climate scale change. So basically, I'm going to leave it there and open it for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Frank, for that nice presentation. I'll pass it off to Yolande first.
Yeah, Frank, I was just wondering, you may have said this, but what is the temporal resolution that you can detect, and how close to present day can you get with those cores that you were talking about in the beginning? Yeah,
the present day sediments at the bottom of the CARIACO Basin are very fluffy, so they're very hard to capture in a core. So there's, I would say that the cores start going back a few hundred years. So there's I think the paper that has examined that the more recent time frame goes back a few thousand years, and that's David Black at Stony Brook University. But the sediment forms very, very slowly, even though there's a high accumulation rate. But we cannot see the last few seasons, or probably even a few years, because it is still so exact what the time resolution of each barb is something that is not quite 100% clear yet. But you can look at groups of several years, tens of years.
Okay.
Frank, looks like we have a question from Chenzai Wang. He said that I saw a strong multi-decadal variation in maybe the AMO, but not an interannual variation from the time series. Can you comment on these?
We do have very strong interannual variation, but they're superimposed on this warming trend from the AMO that probably all of you are familiar with.
Frank, did we lose you?
Can you hear me?
There you go. Sorry, you got cut out for just a second. Could you repeat your answer for us?
Sure. Yeah, we do see strong interannual variation, and there has been a very, very marked decadal variation. We saw a very strong sort of step change in the physics as well as in the biology in the 2000 time frame. So before we had stronger winds and stronger upwelling. Now we have lesser winds and less upwelling, and there has been a huge change in the phytoplankton community that is very, very clear. So many parameters hang together, both chemical, biological, but also the physics. And so that's all superimposed on this warming trend that is probably the AMO.
Great, thank you. Okay, Frank, that was a nice presentation. We're going to go on to our final presenter for the afternoon. This is Ricardo Dominguez. And Ricardo?
Hello.
Hi, you're off mute. Go ahead, you're up.
Okay. First, I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Ricardo Dominguez, and I'm a physical oceanographer with the University of Miami and NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory in Miami. So following up on the topic of initiatives to improve observational coverage, now I'm going to talk about a new effort led by NOAA that was recently implemented and is currently providing a large number of ocean observations in the tropical North Atlantic and in the Caribbean Sea. The title of this project is Sustained and Targeted Ocean Observations for Improving Atlantic Tropical Cyclone Intensity and Hurricane Seasonal Forecasts. And before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of the various project members in making this effort possible. And you may see here their names listed in the slide. And also, this project was funded by the Disasters Appropriations Relief Act of 2013, that is also known as the Sandy Supplemental, and also funded by NOAA, by the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and by the Caribbean Coastal Ocean Observing System. So the main motivation for this initiative comes from the fact that tropical cyclones are commonly observed in regions off from Puerto Rico, in the tropical North Atlantic, in the Caribbean Sea. So on the right side of the slide, you can see the line shows the historical tracks of tropical cyclones that travel through this region, while the dots show the actual location where they intensified into a higher category. So even though these regions, they are really important for the dynamics of tropical cyclones, the amount of ocean observations available in this area was relatively scarce. So here, for example, here, these maps, they show the number of temperature profiles from the World Ocean Atlas 2013. And we can see that during the last decade, there were less than 200 observations available in these areas off from Puerto Rico. So because the upper ocean heat content has been shown to play a key role in the genesis and intensification of tropical cyclones, real-time in-situ observations of upper ocean temperature structure, they would be of great relevance for models used for hurricane forecasts. So to improve, to address this lack of observations in this region, NOAA proposed a multi-institutional network of underwater gliders to carry out sustained and targeted ocean observations in these areas. And the main goal is to investigate the response of the ocean to hurricane force winds, to improve the understanding about the role that the ocean plays in the intensification of tropical cyclones, and also to provide observations to help improve tropical cyclone seasonal and intensity forecasts. We chose underwater gliders among the different observing platforms, mostly because gliders, they can be remotely operated along predetermined tracks. They can stay at sea for an extended period of time, providing a large number of ocean observations in real time, and that way they provide a cost-effective alternative for collecting ocean data. So these gliders, they are autonomous underwater vehicles. They don't have any propeller or any kind of moving parts on their outside. They use the changes in buoyancy combined with fixed wings to create forward motion. And they can be configured with a big variety of oceanographic sensors depending on the application. So for example here, this is a picture of the two gliders that were funded by the proposal. And the gliders, they were initially equipped with a standard CTD, and later on we added a sensor to measure dissolved oxygen. And some specification of these gliders, they can dive up to 1,000 meters, performing generally 5 dives per day, which translates in 10 vertical profiles. These profiles, they are obtained approximately every 3 kilometers, and that way they can travel anywhere between 15 to 20 kilometers per day. And they can, once they are deployed, they can stay at sea for up to 5 months, and that time frame is generally defined by the battery life of the glider, and of course that depends on the amount of sensors installed and that. So this slide shows a brief timeline of our glider operations. The proposal has been submitted in October 2013, funded in December of the same year. By March we purchased both gliders and followed by the training of our personnel in June to learn on how to pilot and operate and maintain these gliders. They were delivered in July, and a few weeks after that, we started the first gliders mission with the deployment of one glider in the Caribbean Sea and one in the tropical North Atlantic. So during this first mission, both gliders, they provided continuous data in real time, and they collected over 2,800 temperature and salinity profiles. And during this first mission, we were lucky enough to have 2 tropical cyclones travel over the location of our gliders. So Tropical Storm Bertha traveled over our glider in the Caribbean Sea in August, and then Hurricane Gonzalo in October 2014 traveled over our glider in the tropical North Atlantic. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more about the observations collected during Hurricane Gonzalo. We recently published a manuscript on GRL describing the upper ocean response to Hurricane Gonzalo based on these observations. So in November 2014, both gliders, they were recovered and prepared for the next mission, which started in February. And they stayed at sea between February and April, collecting over 2,000 profiles. And this time, during the second mission, both gliders were deployed in the Caribbean Sea. And also, this second mission featured the new dissolved oxygen sensor. The third mission is currently underway. Both gliders, they're providing real-time observations during the hurricane season of 2015. And they already collected over 1,000 temperature and dissolved oxygen profiles. And a few weeks ago, we had Tropical Storm Erica travel over the location of our gliders. So one of the points here is that with this new observing system, we're creating a unique data set of ocean conditions under tropical cyclones. And all this data set is provided in real time through our web pages and also through the NOAA's Integrated Ocean Observing System. And the data is also transmitted in real time to the Global Telecommunication System, the GTS, where it is assimilated into forecast systems. In our website, you can also find some general information about the project and also plots with the latest location of the gliders, of the observations collected so far. And for example, and here on the right side, these shows some print screens of the website, and you can see, for example, here the characteristic temperature, salinity, and dissolved oxygen profiles collected in the Caribbean Sea. So I believe I already covered most of the information in this slide, but I just would like to show you this is a map showing the location of the observations collected during the first mission, which was on the hurricane season of 2014. So the red dots here show the track along which the glider navigated, and they collected temperature and salinity observations, while these white dots show the track of the tropical cyclones that traveled through our region during that season. So on the south, Tropical Storm Bertha traveled close to our glider, and the black diamond showed the location of the glider when the storm traveled by. And Hurricane Gonzalo traveled close to our glider in the north. And here, these plots, they show you can see these plots on the website, but they show the time series of temperature and salinity profiles collected during the entire first mission. And about these observations, as I mentioned, we published a manuscript in GRL, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these observations now. So here, showing more into the details, the track of Hurricane Gonzalo, the colors show the intensity of Gonzalo as it traveled by this region. So Gonzalo developed on October 12, and by October 14, it intensified into a Category 3 hurricane as it traveled 85 kilometers from the location of our glider. And here it's a snapshot of the time when Gonzalo traveled close to our glider. This is an infrared image. And so the sampling strategy adopted during this period consisted of sampling the pre-storm temperature and salinity conditions between sites A and B. So the glider traveled between sites A and B before the hurricane reached this region. And during the storm, the glider was parked at site B for 2 days, and that way we could evaluate changes in ocean conditions that were directly forced by the hurricane. And then after the storm, the glider navigated back to site A and then again to site B. And that way we obtained 2 sections after the storm, which enabled the evaluation of changes in ocean conditions that were linked with the hurricane, and also how the ocean started to recover after the hurricane traveled by our region. So unfortunately, I don't have time. I cannot go into the details of these observations, but I do encourage you to read the paper for more information, because it is indeed very interesting to see all the details. But the main points that I wanted to let you know is that we did see a complex response in the upper ocean linked with multiple ocean processes that were linked with the hurricane, and we did see a very important role of salinity in modulating the upper ocean response, and that's because the pre-storm salinity conditions were characterized by a shallow low salinity layer that characterized the barrier layer close to the surface, and our observations indicate that this barrier layer has likely reduced the hurricane force turbulent mixing, which caused a small surface cooling of the ocean of only 0.4 degrees Celsius. After the storm, the sections, they showed that 11 days after the hurricane, the ocean started recovering to pre-storm conditions, but it did not fully recover to pre-storm conditions. And another very interesting results is we compared our observations collected during Hurricane Gonzalo with outputs of H-Wharf HICON. And we saw that H-Wharf HICON overestimated the upper ocean cooling as a response to Hurricane Gonzalo. And we identified that this overestimation was mainly because the model did not reproduce the salinity effects observed in the real ocean. So one of the outcomes of this paper is that we have identified that a better representation of salinity in the model may lead to a better simulation of the upper ocean response. So with this as a summary, AO now has implemented a network of underwater gliders in the tropical North Atlantic and Caribbean Sea. To date, we've collected over 6,000 profiles in the first year of this project, and I want to emphasize this number given the very few observations that were available in this region. So the observations analyzed during Hurricane Gonzalo, they also emphasize the value of these targeted and sustained observations by underwater gliders in this region. As a future work, the gliders observations will continue in 2016. We will continue doing these repeat transects that you see, and we'll have a new glider starting in January of next year. And also the 3 gliders, they will be equipped with additional chlorophyll and CDOM sensors. That way, we believe we will expand the applications of the observations collected by the gliders so that we can look into different ocean processes as well. So that will be all. Thank you very much again for the opportunity, and now I will take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Ricardo. Yolande, do you have any thoughts first?
Yeah, I wondered, this great technology, very interesting, and I wonder just two sort of quick questions, which is when you said that it was a predetermined path, once you deploy them, you have sort of entered what path they're going to take. I'm wondering if that can be changed midstream if you wanted to, if you knew the projected or predicted hurricane path, if you could adjust the glider, or do you just let it run its course?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yes, we can change at any time. We can adapt the track depending on which process we want to look. We try to do the repeat transects, but during tropical cyclones, we adapt the track according to the forecast of the tropical cyclone. And one thing that we learned during this first mission that we had these tropical cyclones is that our glider, as I mentioned before, can move up to 20 kilometers per day. So we don't have much room for chasing the tropical cyclone, which moves much faster. So we learned that from now on, we decided it's generally better to keep the glider parked at the same location, and then we can see the changes directly forced by the hurricane.
Okay, thank you. And then I see that Ernesto has a question for you, which is similar to the one I was going to ask, so I'll let you answer that for Ernesto.
And to repeat that, so those who cannot see the question, Ernesto was asking regarding the sampling strategy, what aspects do you consider when deciding the track to trace?
Yeah.
Ricard, do you have anything to add to that, or do you think you covered it?
Yeah, I'm sorry. No,
sorry,
yeah. As I mentioned, we try to do those repeat transects so that we can produce a consistent data set where we can evaluate the ocean variability along those sections. But we do, when there is an event, we do have the ability of adapting the track according to what we're trying to study.
Great, excellent, thank you. Any other questions or thoughts?
I have another one. This is Yolande. I wondered if you could apply this technology to a different problem besides hurricanes. Where would you go next? Have you thought about any other basins or any other problems you'd like to tackle with them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure if I know how to answer it. But the glider technology is definitely evolving a lot, and one thing that they're already doing is they are using gliders also to monitor, to obtain observations in the Arctic, where it's very hard to go there. So it's a very remote place. So they use a lot of gliders there, and also they have been using gliders in western boundary currents. And but as I said, the technology is still improving a lot. So we may start seeing they becoming more common in the next few years.
Okay, thank you.
And one more question we have that came in. We'll take this as our last question for Ricardo. Have you looked at the near inertial wave signal from storm in the glider data?
Yes, exactly. The paper actually covers that. We did see some signal that indicated the presence of internal waves linked with the hurricane. But yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, we saw those signals as well.
Great. Thanks, Ricardo. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, for all our participants, and especially a big thanks to Yolande for chairing, as well as our 4 speakers. Really great presentations this afternoon, as well as the wonderful presentations by our speakers earlier this afternoon in the session 3 that was before the break. So I hope everyone will join us again for tomorrow, day 3 and day final of the virtual workshop. We will have 2 more sessions again. The first session will start promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, session 5, identifying sources of model biases for the Inter-Americas seas in both coupled and ocean or atmospheric models. We'll have our final poster session during the break, and then we'll have a panel discussion actually for the final session tomorrow. It's a slightly different format. We'll have 3 speakers, George Huffman from NASA, Nick Shea from Miami, and Shangping Zi from Scripps. So hopefully everyone can join us back here tomorrow. Thank you again for today, and this concludes our second day of the workshop. Have a great afternoon.
The conference has been muted.